A warm welcome to this week's special edition of your Energy Frontiers. I am Omono Okonkwo. Financing climate action was one of the major talking points at this week's 2022 spring meetings of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund held in Washington, D.C. The high-profile discussions on financing climate action provided insightful action points from speakers, which include the lead presentation made by the World Bank President, David Malpass. This is an excerpt of the session.
The World Bank has been implementing the Climate Change Action Plan, which is based on integrating climate and development and directly recognizing the value of global public goods. We have much higher spending targets for the World Bank Group, and we're also looking to have those spending and engagements with countries be as effective as possible. We're doing that through reports for countries around the world, CCDRs, that we think will be a powerful instrument to help countries think about their own engagement with both development and integrating it with climate. Around the world, we're working to lower greenhouse gas emissions. This is a challenging task, and also carry out adaptation, help countries with their preparations for climate changes. We're working in other areas of global public goods, such as marine plastic and conservation, all of which take money from the world community and apply it to specific global public goods that are goals of the whole world community. We now are faced with the war in Ukraine. It's having a compounding effect on the cash flow, on human tragedy going on in Ukraine itself, higher food and fertilizer and energy prices around the world, which puts strain on budgets such as the Indonesian fiscal budget, and it's causing stress on top of the pandemic. We see that Europe is changing in its thinking about some aspects of global public goods, including its stance toward natural gas, which is an important source of energy, and nuclear power, also a very important source of base load for electricity production.
It's great to be able today to discuss about climate change, and we know that there are many solutions to help really in fighting climate change. Madam Minister Rania, it's a pleasure to have you today, and thank you for joining us. We know that COP27 will be held in Africa, and we're in Egypt, and you have a very big ambition for this COP27. Can you tell us quickly what you have in mind?
Well, thank you very much, and absolutely a timely conversation on climate. Egypt's presidency is focusing on three main messages. First, our impartiality, even though we are an African nation, but this is a COP for the world, so we're trying to maintain that. Second, as you correctly mentioned, adaptability, adaptation and resilience, extremely important for many developing countries, and the latest crisis we're seeing, Ukraine, Russia, has brought to the forefront, again, the importance of food security and everything that is related to that. And then third, it's going to be what we hope is an implementation COP. So how can we move from the pledges to implementation and to action? So those are the three key messages.
But Minister, as you said, there were a lot of pledges in COP26. So tell us a little bit what the private sector can do to support all these priorities.
Let me first acknowledge IFC's important role in mobilizing private sector and pushing private sector investments in countries. The government did structural reforms which were very, very important to be able to crowd in private sector investments. And that is when the IFC and many other institutions were also able to bring in their investments to support the energy transition.
You talked about regulation, you talked about a certain number of things that needs to be done. But one of the things that we're hearing very much from the private sector is green taxonomy. People want to know when they invest in to support the fight against climate change that is really targeted to activities which are related to that. So what is your view about green taxonomy?
I think it's absolutely correct. When the climate conversation is a multi-stakeholder conversation. It includes governments, private sector, citizens, as well as the international community. And that's why it's very important from the government side to have a clear vision, to communicate it. And if there are any legislative impediments for private sector engagement, try and address those. Also, very important are the innovative types of financing. And, one of the achievements of Glasgow was private sector engagement was very, very high on the agenda. And we saw lots of commitments from private sector entities. And the point is now, how can we take these pledges into implementation? And that requires all of us working together to be able to create de-risking opportunities for the private sector through innovative tools, blended tools, and so forth. And there's a wealth of experience, be it at the IFC, at EBRD, other institutions that have actually showcased projects, weather mitigation or adaptation in emerging markets and middle-income countries. And these are examples that we want to be able also to showcase and replicate. And it also addresses the green taxonomy that you just mentioned, because it gives comfort or confidence that whatever target is set by the government and the private sector is able to come in, that also is achievable. I would just conclude by saying that all stakeholders have a role to play, and there is complementarity. The government needs to be clear and needs to be committed through taking very important reforms in its own right. Also, the private sector needs to also show its commitment, and then the international community or the multilateral development banks, and of course IFC being a key partner on private sector engagement, also play a role. So I think it's complementarity among all stakeholders, but I believe that all of us are very much committed, and climate is very high on everybody's agenda.
Tell us a little bit more about what you're doing.
Sure, and greetings from London, and thanks so much, Maktar, for inviting me onto the panel today. I think one of the things that we discussed in Glasgow was this point about the right kind of capital into the right kind of climate investment opportunities. And that really should be the tagline for financing the whole of the zero carbon transition. I think it really perfectly captures the task at hand, which is about creating the opportunities for finance providers to fund the transition in a way that meets their risk-adjusted returns. Capital can flow. And those barriers can take many forms, as we know, but as we're talking about risk and rewards, let's focus on possible solutions to removing financial barriers.
What will it take today if we want to mobilize more resources from emerging economies? Especially, I think that there will be a lot of sensitivity to what Eve just said about social bonds, linking environment with social inclusion. So tell me, what do you think about that?
I'd be happy to. I think as a broad comment, I'd say, this is really a challenge of leadership and collaboration. And it's across all economies, as Eve just said, and not only emerging markets. And, whilst I mentioned earlier a financial mechanism that channels government capital efficiently alongside development and private capital, in order to create lending and investment opportunities for local banks and investors, but we can't solve for a 1.5 degree aligned world purely through financial instruments. We clearly need that enabling policy and regulatory frameworks in country, as well as the mechanisms to improve creditworthiness, so that we can secure both local and international funds. There are no intellectually coherent high carbon pathways to prosperity. The science and the recent IPCC report has been very, very clear on this. So building these collaborative initiatives and these institutions that involve policymakers, industry experts, and financiers is absolutely key.
Which seems to be coming more and more into conversation is that maybe more investment in efficiency. You're talking about fighting against climate change by reducing emission, and hearing people going to COP27, increasingly I hear people talking about reducing the waste in networks, in electricity network, reducing the leakages in water pipes, reducing all these inefficiency that we have. What is your take on that?
Well, I fully agree with you. Here at the Green Finance Institute, one of our flagship projects has been looking at the energy efficiency of buildings, which, here in the UK, our building stock accounts for about 1/4 of our emissions. And this is clearly a topic that really resonates with consumers. It resonates with the electorate. But finding ways of financing that upfront capital expenditure that then enables people to have lower energy bills. Couldn't agree more with your emphasis on this is about both supply and demand. It's about efficiency. It's about using resources well and efficiently, as well as looking at our sources of demand and having, more reliance on renewable energies and climate smart infra.
Welcome back to the show. A recent Wood Mackenzie analysis estimates that achieving universal electricity access in Sub-Saharan Africa by 2030 presents a $350 billion USD opportunity in decentralized power grids. On Energy Quick Chat this week, Benjamin Attia, Principal Research Analyst in the Energy Transition Practice at Wood Mackenzie, is here to offer insights on how these decentralized grids can work in the region. Here is an excerpt of our conversation, but you can watch the entire interview on our Frontier Africa Reports YouTube page. Enjoy it. So let's begin. Public electric utilities in Sub-Saharan Africa are largely loss-making. What is the way out?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and thanks so much for having me on the show. I would say there's no singular answer and there's no uniform answer, but I think that the simple way to think about this is that customers won't pay high prices for bad service, right? So high tariffs, low quality of power, low reliability. These are the sorts of things that lock utilities out of being able to become profitable, to have their customers be more satisfied, to consume more electricity. So I think there's a few ways we could approach this. One would be grid intensification. This is especially true for populations that are under the grid. So there's about 110 million people roughly across the region that live, basically within a few kilometers of grid infrastructure and yet don't have a grid connection. So those are some sort of low-hanging fruit customers, typically in urban or peri-urban areas, who will typically have higher demand with a very low cost to connect them. Relative to rural populations, Another way that we can do this is advanced metering. So making sure that customers are billed appropriately for the power that they consume rather than doing prepaid or assumed electricity charges, which is true in some markets. And obviously that makes customers relatively upset around paying for power that they may or may not have actually consumed. Beyond that, tariff reform is really important. As I said, paying a high tariff for low quality of power is simply, untenable, and rightly so. So as a result of that, thinking about how do we make tariffs cost reflective so that utilities can actually recover their costs and make sure that they're also affordable for customers. And one really great example is the service-based tariff in Nigeria, which allows customers to pay a higher tariff based on the better quality service they get and a lower tariff if the service quality is poor. And all of this would be achieved through regulatory action. Some technical assistance support might help here. But what really needs to happen is the utilities need to make sure that they're charging cost-reflective tariffs and offering high-quality service. That's kind of the key formula there.
Okay, thank you. So explain the idea of a bottom-up decentralized solar and storage grid that could transform Africa's energy future and for low-income earners in particular.
Yeah, so there's a few different ways that we could think about this. I think maybe the best way to think about this is utilities using integrated energy planning or integrated electrification planning. And what that basically means is helping the utility understand where is the least cost solution most appropriate for each source of demand. So in some cases, that's a centralized grid that needs to be improved, like we were just speaking about. And in some parts of countries where it's not really financially tenable to extend the grid or to improve the quality of service of the grid in some areas, it may make more sense to build the grid from the bottom up rather than from the top down. And what we mean by that is that we would see solar often paired with battery storage, and in some cases, either hybridizing existing diesel to be able to achieve 24/7 power or something very close to that at a much lower cost with zero carbon, and then in a way that can be much more nimbly deployed too. So extending the grid means you need to start from where the grid ends, right? But if you are deploying an off-grid sort of captive self-generation system, it can be deployed anywhere, and it can, there's no fuel cost, there's no delivery cost, right? So it's simply, setting up a solar and storage system in a community once the demand has been assessed and it's clear that the customers will consume the electricity that the system produces. So what that means, especially for low-income consumers, is that while there was previously a very high cost hurdle to getting electricity from the grid to the last mile, you can sort of skip that where appropriate and where the economics make sense, and go directly to that source of demand and build a captive system on site. I mean, that's a really revolutionary idea, particularly across the region where we're seeing this happening with sub-Saharan African markets at the forefront, deploying standalone solar systems and solar mini grids that can directly meet demand on site rather than waiting for the grid to arrive when it in fact never may arrive.
Okay, so here is a very important question. A lot of people have been looking out for this particular question. So let's get down to it. In your professional opinion, do you think sub-Saharan Africa can achieve industrialization using renewable-based decentralized grids?
Very good question, yes, and a very hotly contested question in many circles. I think the short answer is in some places yes, and in other places no. Some of these bottom-up grids are actually quite large, megawatt scale capacity. Some of the mini grid projects that are being rolled out in the DRC right now, for example, power hundreds of thousands of households, but also have capacity to power businesses. But on the whole, in general, most off-grid energy access solutions providing first-time electricity or hybridization of existing diesel gensets for SMEs are typically not large enough to achieve industrialization. So that's when I say appropriate energy solutions, it's really important to understand what that means. And that means that we're talking about the right type of solution to meet the right type of demand. So where we have large industrial users, some of them depend on diesel, some of them depend on the grid. Solar can play a role there. Decentralized solutions can play a role there. But ultimately, Africa's grid, the entire region writ large, speaking at a very high level, is going to need to do a lot of work to expand the generation, transmission, and distribution capacity of the centralized system to power larger loads that are economically productive, and particularly those that contribute to climate resilience. So it's really it's a contested issue. There's a lot of maybe overly gung-ho opinions about how this should go. And ultimately, I think on this topic and on many other topics, it's best to leave these decisions to the sovereignty of African governments, utilities, and regulators to make the decisions that are best for their own country and that align with the country's goals, objectives, and commitments. So I think there's a role for these solutions to play. On the whole, across the region, we estimate that roughly 20% of the investment opportunity between now and 2030 for the energy access and electricity sector is for decentralized off-grid solutions. And some of the larger systems can power industrial loads, but we're still talking about 80% of the investment opportunity being on the grid. So it's important to strike that balance.
And that is the package for this edition of Your Energy Frontiers. And we thank you for watching. You can follow the show on Frontier Africa Report's website and all our social media accounts as shown on the screen. I am Omono Okonkwo, and I will see you next time.